The Vietnam War, often regarded as one of the most controversial conflicts in modern history, was a complex web of political, ideological, and strategic factors. The U.S. are often blamed and said they should never have interfered, but the U.S. actually had some pretty good reasons. So let's get right into it. Vietnam, part of French Indochina, was under French colonial rule since 1887. This colonization served as a strategic foothold for France and allowed it to reinforce Catholic missionaries in Southeast Asia. However, World War II and the subsequent Japanese invasion disrupted French control over Indochina. Japan ruled through Emperor Bao Dai as a puppet, which prompted Ho Chi Minh to lead the Viet Minh, a communist force, against the Japanese occupiers. After Japan's defeat in 1945, the Viet Minh declared Vietnamese independence with Hanoi as its capital, initiating the First Indochina War against the French, who sought to reclaim their colony. At this juncture, the Cold War was intensifying, with the United States supporting anti-communist regimes while China and the Soviet Union backed pro-communist governments. Given the global context, the USA and Britain supported the French in South Vietnam, establishing the state of Vietnam with Emperor Bao Dai as its leader in an anti-communist regime. The United States, aware of the potential domino effect of communism spread in Asia, became deeply invested in preventing its expansion. President Dwight D. Eisenhower provided American military advisors to assist the French, but he was reluctant to commit ground troops. The Viet Minh ultimately emerged victorious against the French, leading to the Geneva Accords of 1954. These accords divided Vietnam into the State of Vietnam, South, and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, North, ending French Indochina. South Vietnam, led by Ngo Dinh Diem, began preparing for a referendum on reunification, but doubts about its fairness lingered. Diem's manipulation of the vote resulted in a massive majority favoring the South's continued separation. As Vietnam entered the Second Indochina War, or the Vietnam War as it's commonly known in the West, the United States watched with increasing apprehension. It believed that the fall of Vietnam to communism would have dire consequences, potentially threatening neighboring nations like India and Japan. Diem took ruthless measures to quell communist activities in the South, further aggravating tensions. In 1960, the National Liberation Front, NLF, or Viet Cong, emerged as a communist force in the South, receiving support from North Vietnam via the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The United States responded by sending military advisors and equipment to aid the South Vietnamese government. Despite this assistance, the South Vietnam Army faced difficulties and suffered defeats at the hands of the NLF. President John F. Kennedy, faced with various challenges related to the spread of communism, recognized Vietnam as a critical battleground in the Cold War. Although initially hesitant to commit American troops, Kennedy escalated U.S. involvement by sending more military advisors and equipment. However, the South Vietnamese government remained politically corrupt and struggled to combat guerrilla forces effectively. By 1963, tensions escalated further as the pro-Catholic government began discriminating against Buddhists, leading to widespread protests. A coup in November 1963 resulted in the assassination of Diem and his advisor, paving the way for political chaos in the South. Kennedy's assassination in Dallas, Texas, just weeks later added to the turmoil. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964 marked a turning point in the war. The alleged attacks on the USS Maddox by North Vietnamese torpedo boats prompted President Lyndon B. Johnson to order airstrikes and secure the Gulf of Tonkin resolution from Congress. This resolution granted Johnson the authority to escalate U.S. involvement without an official declaration of war, as he assured the American public that he would not deploy American troops to Vietnam. This incident further drew the United States into the conflict. As tensions rose, the U.S. initiated the draft, leading to protests as many young men sought to avoid conscription. The NLF and North Vietnamese forces continued to score victories against the South, prompting Johnson to order bombing campaigns over North Vietnam and the deployment of the first U.S. ground troops in March 1965. Neighboring Laos also fell into civil war, resulting in Operation Barrel Roll, an attempt to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Nevertheless, the conflict continued, exacerbated by the use of controversial weapons like napalm. General William Westmoreland, commanding American forces, advocated for an offensive strategy to win the war. President Johnson approved this approach, leading to further escalation. South Vietnam's Air Marshal Nguyen Chau Kai became Prime Minister in 1965, bringing a modicum of political stability to the South. The U.S. called upon its SEATO allies and South Korea to contribute troops to the conflict. Despite transitioning to an offensive stance, the harsh conditions and limited progress took a toll on troop morale. Nonetheless, President Johnson continued to reassure the public that the war was proceeding as planned. In 1968, The Tet Offensive took the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces by surprise. The NLF and North Vietnamese launched a massive offensive across the South during the Vietnamese New Year. While the U.S. and South Vietnamese mounted an effective counterattack, the battle for Hue, the former capital, was especially brutal, resulting in significant civilian casualties. Media coverage of the war, often at odds with the official narrative, began to erode public support for the conflict. The election of Richard Nixon as president in 1969 brought about significant changes in U.S. strategy. Nixon began withdrawing troops from Vietnam and sought to replace them with South Vietnamese forces. His administration also engaged in diplomatic efforts to isolate North Vietnam from its communist allies, including China and the Soviet Union. The U.S. conducted bombing campaigns in neighboring Cambodia, further escalating tensions and sparking protests across the United States. The release of the Pentagon Papers in 1971, revealing classified documents related to the war, fueled public dissent. The Easter Offensive in 1972 saw renewed hostilities, prompting the U.S. to resume bombing North Vietnam. Eventually, peace talks began in Paris, leading to the signing of the Paris Accords in 1973. These agreements resulted in the cessation of U.S. bombing in North Vietnam, the withdrawal of all U.S. ground troops by March 1973, and the end of the draft. Henry Kissinger and North Vietnam's foreign minister, Lou Duc Tho, were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, although Tho declined, citing that true peace had not yet been achieved in Vietnam. Following U.S. withdrawal, the South's economy struggled, and it faced increased challenges. In 1975, North Vietnam launched a successful offensive, capturing Saigon and reunifying the country. The massive upheaval in Cambodia led to the Khmer Rouge's brutal rule and a subsequent conflict involving Vietnam, China, and Thailand. Vietnam's economy faced hardships throughout the 1970s and 1980s, with refugees fleeing the country. To sum it up, the Vietnam War was a very complicated and argument-causing war. The U.S. got involved in this war because of different reasons like history, politics, and strategy. The U.S. was afraid of communism, and since they were rivals with the Soviet Union, they saw Vietnam as an important place to fight against it. So thank you so much for watching and see you in the next video.